Hello, everybody, and welcome to chapter 40 of the book of Bereishit as we continue to travel through Tanach. Chapter 40 also has 23 verses, and it's found in the Koran Sachs Chumash on page 266 and 267. This chapter follows on from the narrative of chapter 39, where Yosef is still in prison, and he is placed in charge of the royal prisoners. And we see that Paro's chief cupbearer and chief baker are jailed after offending Paro, and both have troubling dreams on the same night. Yosef notices their distress and asks why they appear troubled. He encourages each man to share his dream, and Yosef interprets them accurately. The cupbearer will be restored to his position in 3 days, while the baker will be executed. Yosef tries to take advantage of the situation and asks the cupbearer to remember him and mention him to Pharaoh. But once freed, the cupbearer forgets Yosef entirely. And as we reach the end of this chapter, Yosef will still remain in prison, waiting for an opportunity for freedom. With that introduction in mind, let's turn to chapter 40, verse 1. Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, and it was after some time, chatu mashkei melech Mitzrayim v'ha'ofer la'adoneihem lemelech Mitzrayim. The cupbearer of the king of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, and the baker transgressed, offended their master, the king of Egypt. Verse 2, Vayiktzov Paro al shnei sarisav, and Paro was angry with the two officials, al sar hamashkim v'al sar ha'ofim, his chief cupbearer and his chief baker. Verse 3, Vayitan osam b'mishmar beis sar hatapachim el beis hasohar. He placed them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Or as some translations have Sar HaTabachim as the chief executioner or the chief butcher, which is a reference to Potiphar. Either way, the verse ends, Makom asher Yosef asur sham, in the very place where Yosef was imprisoned. Verse 4, Vayifkod Sar HaTabachim es Yosef itam, Vayishares osam. The captain of the guard or the chief butcher, executioner, assigned them to Yosef, and it was Yosef who attended to them. Vayhiyu yamim b'mishmar, and they remained imprisoned for some days. Verse 5, Vaychalmu chalom shnehem, the two of them had dreams. Ish chalomo balayla echad, each one had his dream on the same night. Ish kafisron chalomo, each one according to the interpretation of his dream. Hamashkeh v'ha'ofer asher lemelech Mitzrayim, the cupbearer and the baker to the king of Mitzrayim, asher asurim b'veis hasohar, who are confined in the prison. And our rabbis explained that not only did they have their own dreams, but they actually dreamt the interpretation of the other dream as well. Verse 6, Vayavo alehem Yosef baboker. Yosef came to them the next morning, Vayarosam v'hinam zoafim, and he saw that they were both distressed. Verse 7, Vayishal es srisei Pharaoh, and he asked Pharaoh's officials, Asher ito b'mishmar beis Adonav, who were confined with him in the house of his master, Lemor, saying, Madua panechem ra'im hayom, why are you looking so troubled today? Why the long face? And our rabbis point out here that the care and courtesy that Yosef is taking at this point shows that he is destined for greatness. And this is seen as a turning point for him. Verse 8, Vayomeru elav, and they said to him, Chalom chalamnu, we both had dreams. Ufoser enoso, there is no one to interpret them. Vayomer alehem Yosef, and Yosef said to them, Halon lelohim pisronim saprun ali. Interpretation belongs to Hashem. Tell me your dreams. And our rabbis point out that this as well is a very important moment, that Yosef is not attributing his own successes to his own talents and skills. Rather, he understands that these are all divinely given gifts. Verse 9, Vayisaper sar hamashkim es chalomo leYosef. The chief cupbearer told his dream to Yosef, Vayomer lo, and he said to him, B'chalomi, in my dream, v'hine gefen lefanai, there was a vine in front of me. Verse 10, Uva gefen shlosha sarigim, the vine had 3 branches. V'hi chafarachas alsan nitza, hivshilu ashkaloseha anavim. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Verse 11, V'chos paro biadi, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. Va'ikach eso anavim, I took the grapes. Va'eschat osam el kos paro, and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup. Va'etein esakos al kaf paro, and I placed the cup in his hand. Verse 12, Vayomer lo Yosef, Yosef said to him, Zeh pisromo, this is the interpretation. Shloshes hasarigim, shloshes yamim hein. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Ba'od shloshes yamim, in another 3 days' time, Yisa Pharaoh es roshecha. Pharaoh will lift your head, v'hashivacha al kanecha, and restore you to your position. V'nosata chos paro biyado, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand again. Kamishpat harishon asher hayisa mashkehu, as you did when you were his cupbearer. Verse 14, Ki im zachartani itecha, if only you would think of me, kasher yitavlach, when it goes well for you. V'asisa na imadi chased, and do me this kindness. Please mention me to Pharaoh so as to free me from this place. Verse 15, Ki gunavti me eretz ha'ivrim. For the truth is, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. V'gampo lo asisi mu'uma, ki samu osi babor. And I have done nothing to deserve being placed in this pit. Verse 16, Vayar sahawafim ki top pasar. The chief baker saw that he had given a favorable interpretation. Vayomer el Yosef, and he said to Yosef, Af ani b'chalomi, I also had a dream. V'hinei shlosha salei chori al roshi, and there were 3 wicker baskets on my head. Verse 17, Uvasal ha'elyon, and in the upper basket, mikol ma'achal paro ma'aseh ofer, were all kinds of Pharaoh's baked goods. V'ha'of ochelosam min hasal me'al roshi. But birds were eating them out of the basket above my head. Verse 18, Vayan Yosef, and Yosef answered, Vayomer, and he said, Ze pisrono, this is the interpretation. Shloshes hasalim, shloshes yamim hein. The 3 baskets represent 3 days. Verse 19, Ba'od shloshes yamim, in another 3 days' time, Yisa Pharaoh es roshecha mi'alecha. Pharaoh will lift up your head entirely, meaning he will lift it up from your body. V'sala osecha ala eitz, and he will hang you from a tree. Va'ochal ha'of es basarecha mi'alecha, and birds will eat your flesh from you. Why does Yosef give 2 such radically different dreams? So the rabbis do try to interpret this as well, and they notice that with the cupbearer's dream, he is back in active service. And Yosef understood from there that he was going to be restored to his position. But with the chief baker, he understands that the only reason why birds would be able to attack him in the dream is if they don't recognize him as a threat. Why would they not recognize him as a threat? Because he would no longer be alive. And that is how he was able to deduce that this was a sign that he was not going to survive this. Why were these 2 people in prison? Our rabbis point out that Pharaoh had imprisoned the chief cupbearer after he found a fly in his wine, and the baker had been imprisoned after he had found a stone in his bread. And herein also lies an understanding of why they faced 2 such drastically different punishments. Because a fly can fall into the wine quite innocently. When it comes to baking something like a stone inside the loaf of bread, the baker should have really been more careful. And so he ends up being held accountable for his sin, whereas the cupbearer will be freed once again. And indeed, verse 20, Vayhi bayom hashlishi, and it was 3 days later, Yom Huledes es Paro, it was Pharaoh's birthday. By the way, I think this is the only time a birthday is mentioned in the Torah. Vayas mishter l'chol avadav, and he made a feast for all his servants. Vayisa es rosh sar hamashkim, ves rosh sar haofim besoch avadav, and he singled out his chief cupbearer and his chief baker among his servants. Verse 21, Vayashev es sar hamashkim al mashkehu, he restored the chief cupbearer to his position. Vayiten akos al kaf paro, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Verse 22, Ves sar haofim tala, but he hung the chief baker, kasher pasah lahem Yosef, as Yosef had interpreted and had predicted. And finally, verse 23, with the chief cupbearer back in position, you would expect him to now remember Yosef, and yet the chapter ends, V'lo zachar sar hamashkim es Yosef vayishkachehu. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Yosef, he forgot him. And our rabbis point out that actually it was Hashem that orchestrated for the chief cupbearer to forget him. And this was by way of punishment to Yosef for not having trusted that Hashem would sort him out directly, and instead felt that he would have to intervene and get the chief cupbearer to act on his behalf. As a result, he ends up spending another 2 years in prison. And our next chapter, chapter 41, will pick the story up with Pharaoh's unsettling dreams, which lead him to bring Yosef to come and interpret them for him. So that brings us to the end of chapter 40. It also brings us to the end of Parshas Vayeshev, We'll pick up with chapter 41 and the beginning of Parshas Miketz next time. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful day.